The studio lights had barely cooled. The audience was still wiping tears from their eyes. The cameras were still rolling the last laughs of a Jimmy Kimmel segment so sharp, so surgical, so unforgiving that every family member mentioned in it could feel the ground shifting under their feet before the credits even started. Somewhere in New York, a phone was ringing. A letter was being drafted. A man who had spent his entire adult life hiding behind a famous last name was pacing across a room, shouting at a lawyer, demanding that something be done. His name was Donald Trump Jr., and he had just made the single biggest mistake of his public life. He had decided to send a cease and desist letter to one of the sharpest comedians in America. Not for lying, not for slander, not for defamation, for something far more dangerous than any of those things, for telling the truth, for reading his own messages back to him, for reminding the entire country what he had done, who he had talked to, and exactly how badly he had embarrassed himself trying to cover it up. What you are about to read is the story of how one late-night comedian became public enemy number one to the Trump family, not by inventing anything, but simply by refusing to forget. It all started with a leak, a real one. Donald Trump Jr., the man his father once tried to convince the country was a business genius, had been caught in direct private contact with WikiLeaks, the organization that leaked stolen Democratic emails during the 2016 election, the organization his father had publicly praised more times during the campaign than he had publicly praised his own wife. And Don Jr., in his infinite, boundless wisdom, had decided to begin one of his private messages to that organization with 3 small words that would follow him for the rest of his life. Off the record, to WikiLeaks. To the organization whose entire reason for existing, whose literal corporate mission, whose name, printed right on the front of everything they do, is leaking things that are supposed to be off the record. Jimmy Kimmel read that line out loud on live television with the face of a man who could not believe his luck. He paused. He let it sit. He looked at the camera as if he were checking to see whether he had misread something, and then he simply repeated it. Off the record, to WikiLeaks. He did not editorialize. He did not oversell it. He just let the absurdity do its own work, because sometimes the joke is already written into the news, and all a comedian has to do is read it slowly enough that the whole country finally hears it. Kimmel kept going. He pointed out that Don Jr. had also tried to minimize his relationship with WikiLeaks on his Twitter account, tried to suggest the whole thing was nothing. But the receipts were already public. The messages were already printed. The evidence was already sitting on the screen behind the host. And Kimmel, with that small smirk he gets when he knows he is about to land something sharp, suggested that maybe Don Jr. had simply gotten confused. Maybe he thought he had been chatting with Nene Leakes from The Real Housewives. The audience lost it, because somehow, for one split second, that explanation felt more generous than the actual one. Then Kimmel took it even further. He did not just report it, he dramatized it. He staged a little sketch where an actor playing a WikiLeaks representative walked onto the show and calmly explained the nature of their connection to Don Jr. They did not have a relationship, the actor said. They had direct messaged him on Twitter. He had sent them back, reportedly, 4 red heart emojis and 1 eggplant. The room exploded. It was not a relationship, the actor clarified. It was more of a friends with benefits situation. They were not putting labels on things. They were keeping it loose. They were open to colluding with other people. Open to colluding with other people. That was the line that went around the world before the hour ended. Because that was not just a joke. That was satire so sharp, so surgical, so legally precise that it required its own small disclaimer. Kimmel had not made up a single fact. He had just taken what was already true, already documented, already sitting in the public record, and dramatized it just enough that America could not look away from it anymore. 4 red heart emojis and an eggplant. That was not political coordination. That was, as Kimmel made perfectly clear, texting with treason. But the WikiLeaks scandal was just the appetizer. Because years later, Don Jr. found himself walking into a New York courtroom for a completely different reason, a $250 million fraud case against the Trump organization. And Jimmy Kimmel was there to document every single humiliating second of it. Not in person. He did not need to be. He had the footage. He had the headlines. He had the photos. He had everything he needed to slice the whole thing apart from behind his desk. Kimmel pointed out that while Don Jr. was in New York preparing to testify in that courtroom, his fiancée was attending a Halloween party dressed up as Snow White. Let that sit for a moment, Kimmel said. His fiancée dressed as Snow White while he was preparing to testify in a fraud trial. That, Kimmel explained, was not just tone deaf. That was dissociative. That was the behavior of a family so disconnected from consequence, so untouched by reality, so committed to performing happiness for cameras, that even an active fraud trial could not slow down the costume parade. Kimmel kept stacking it. He showed the photos, the poses, the smiles, the outfits, the glitter, all of it happening at the exact moment Don Jr. was being grilled on the witness stand as part of a case against his own father's business. Kimmel compared him to a tiny soprano. He imagined what must have been going through the man's head up there on the stand. He could not resist the joke that Don Jr. was probably quietly regretting not wearing any makeup for the occasion. Then he landed the line that cut the deepest. He said that Don Jr. was a man who lacked intelligence and also somehow lacked charisma, and the crowd howled because it was not really an insult. It was an inventory, a quiet, honest list of what the man did not have. And it was devastating because it was true. Don Jr. had built an entire public identity around a famous last name, and when the last name was removed from the equation, the man standing there had very little left to recommend him. Then Kimmel hit a sentence that somehow made the whole moment even more absurd. He announced almost offhand that Don Jr. had been sworn in on an upside-down Bible. He said it like it was a detail from a news report. He said it like it was just one more thing. Whether that was metaphorical or literal, Kimmel shrugged. It was perfect. Because Don Jr.'s entire testimony was inverted truth. Everything upside down, everything pointing the wrong way, everything backwards. And then Kimmel made the prediction that the rest of the country would watch play out over the following months. He said Don Jr. would finish his testimony. Eric would follow. And then their father would eventually stand in front of a camera and claim he had never really met either of them. That was not a joke. That was not even a prediction. That was pattern recognition. Because that is what Donald Trump does. When his children become liabilities, he pretends they do not exist. Kimmel paused, let the audience breathe, and then he asked the question that had been hanging in the air all night. Where was Trump during his son's testimony? Was he in that courtroom? Was he in the gallery supporting his family? Was he waiting outside for his son to walk out of the building? No. He was throwing a Halloween party. He was hosting an event. He was dressing up. He was working the room. He was posing for photos. And in between all of that, he was posting furiously on his own social media platform, raging at the judge, calling the legal profession a disgrace, and screaming the line that had now become his single most reliable refrain, "Leave my children alone." Kimmel read the line back with perfect timing. "Leave my children alone," he repeated. He let it land. He shook his head slightly, and then he delivered the cleanest cut of the entire segment. "Leave my children alone," he said. "It is easy. I have done it their whole lives." The audience howled for a full 20 seconds. Because that was not just a punchline. That was biographical truth. Trump does not protect his children. He uses them. He puts them in front of the cameras when things are going well. He puts them on stages. He puts them in meetings. He puts them in business deals. He puts them in courtrooms. And when it all collapses, when the fraud case starts, when the WikiLeaks messages surface, when the evidence is too overwhelming even for Fox News to ignore, he throws a Halloween party, writes a post declaring himself the only real victim in the whole situation, and moves on like nothing happened. Kimmel read that post too. "There is no victim," Trump had written, "except me." Kimmel repeated it slowly. "There is no victim," he said, "except me." Trump's sons were sitting in a courtroom, testifying in a fraud trial, with their futures on the line, and the father of the family was insisting that he, personally, was the real victim. That, Kimmel said, was not narcissism. That was pathology. Then Kimmel stacked the final observation that tied the entire segment together. He said you had to hand it to the Trumps. They stuck together. Whether they were running a fake university, or a phony charitable organization, or just burying their own mother on a golf course for a tax break, the audience screamed with recognition because every single item on that list was real. Trump University had been shut down for fraud. The Trump Foundation had been dissolved for misuse of funds. And yes, the family really had buried Ivana Trump on a golf course in a way that conveniently reduced the tax burden on that specific property. Kimmel was not inventing a single thing. He was simply reading from the record. He was simply remembering. But the fraud trial was only one of the legal problems the family was juggling. Kimmel pointed out that by this point, Trump had accumulated so many court dates that his own lawyers were reportedly having difficulty tracking them all. There were cases in New York, cases in Florida, cases in Georgia, cases in federal court, cases in state court, cases before grand juries. Kimmel joked that no team of attorneys in American history had ever racked up more unpaid billable hours than the people currently representing the Trump family. And Trump, of course, was trying to paint himself as a political martyr through all of it. He kept insisting the whole thing was a conspiracy orchestrated by his arch-enemy, Joe Biden. He kept demanding that all legal proceedings be frozen until after the election. He kept promising to make America great again, to put America first, and, in one moment that Kimmel could not believe was real, to continue calling the country by the incredibly creative and original name, the United States of America. Kimmel played the clip, Trump announcing, almost proudly, that the country was going to be called the United States of America. Then Kimmel looked at the camera with the blankest possible expression and said, "Deadpan, that is a great name." The audience collapsed. Because Trump had just, on live television, in front of millions, effectively named the country like he had invented it, like he had just come up with it over breakfast, like nobody had ever thought of it before. Then Kimmel moved on to what might have been the most bizarre claim of the week. Trump had stood in front of a microphone and warned the country that dangerous people were pouring across the southern border. That much was standard Trump rhetoric. But this time, in the middle of that warning, he had mentioned Hannibal Lecter, the fictional cannibal, from the movie, the character played by Anthony Hopkins, Silence of the Lambs. "Remember," Trump had said, and Kimmel had cut his camera back to himself with the face of a man who genuinely did not know whether the former president had suffered some kind of medical event on stage. "Yes," he said, "we remember Hannibal Lecter. We just have no idea what you were talking about. Are there fictional cannibals at the border now? Or did you fall asleep with the movie on last night?" The audience laughed, but the laugh had a very specific edge to it, because that was not policy, that was not strategy, that was not even standard political exaggeration. That was a former president publicly confusing the plot of a 1991 horror film with a current immigration crisis. And Kimmel's question was the only rational response a reasonable human being could possibly give. But this was the point where Don Jr. finally broke. Because Kimmel did not just mock the WikiLeaks messages once. He kept bringing them up, week after week. He kept showing the screenshots. He kept repeating the phrase off the record. He kept reminding the country that the son of the then President of the United States had directly coordinated with a foreign organization and had been dumb enough to try to go off the record with a leak operation. Don Jr. could not make the story go away. He could not outrun it. He could not drown it out. He could not spin it into a partisan grievance, so he did what every member of his family does when they cannot argue with facts. He called his lawyers. According to sources close to the show, Don Jr.'s legal team sent Kimmel a cease and desist letter, claiming the segments were defamatory, claiming the segments were damaging to his reputation. His reputation, the same reputation built on writing off the record to WikiLeaks, on being sworn in on an upside-down Bible, on being described by a late-night comedian, accurately, as a man who lacked intelligence and also lacked charisma. Kimmel's response was simple. He read the letter out loud, on his own show, in front of the country, and then he laughed, because you cannot defame a man by showing his own messages. You cannot damage a reputation that has already been buried under a mountain of his own documented words. You cannot sue your way out of something the whole country has already watched. Don Jr. did not call his lawyers because Kimmel had lied about him. He called his lawyers because Kimmel had remembered. And that, in the end, is what makes this entire saga so perfect. Don Jr. is not just defending himself, he is defending the family business. And the family business, as Kimmel had already shown, is not real estate. It is fraud, the fake university, the phony charity, the burial on the golf course, the tax schemes, the lawsuits, the children dragged into courtrooms, the endless claim to victimhood every time one of them gets caught. That is not a political attack. That is a corporate history written in public. And when Jimmy Kimmel reads that history back on television, when he connects the dots on screen, when he refuses to let the country forget what just happened 2 years ago, and 2 months ago, and 2 weeks ago, the Trumps do not argue. They do not deny. They do not respond with facts of their own. They sue, because the truth is not their opponent. Memory is. And memory does not back down when a lawyer sends it a letter. Trump said, "Leave my children alone." Kimmel answered very gently that someone already had, all their lives, and history would remember which one of those two men had been telling the truth. If this story hit you the way it hit that audience, tap the subscribe button right now. Ring the bell so you do not miss the next breakdown. Drop a comment and tell us which line cut the deepest. Was it off the record? Was it the upside-down Bible? Was it leave my children alone? Because these stories are not just comedy. They are quiet little records of a moment in America that will still be getting studied long after the lawsuits end. And the next one is coming soon. You are not going to want to miss a second of it.